Alrighty, good morning and welcome back to the Florida Rail Museum. It's Tuesday, August 22nd, 2023, and we have a little bit of a project that I'll take you guys along for today down on our track, which actually this morning, American Track has just finished tamping to our parish switch. So the tamping is all done for our track. So all we'll have to do is go down, regulate some of the ballast, spray the track for weeds, which is actually one of the things we're gonna do today, and check the main thing, which is the track bolts. Our track is 75-pound jointed rail laid in 39-foot sections, and there's every 15 feet staggered from east rail to west rail, there's a rail joint. And that is what holds those 39-foot sections of rail together to create the continuous track that we have. And here is what a rail joint looks like. We have two different styles here on our line. The simple double bars held by these bolts, and we also have what are called Weber joints, where the piece is actually held together with two bars and a piece of hardened pine wood that is actually inside the joint bar, because before lock washers were created, which are used on these more modern style joints, that's what held the bolts in. I'll show you a few examples of Weber joints later on in this video as we go down the track, but basically what's to be absorbed from this is that each one of these bolts is what holds the two joint bars, one on each side of the rail, to the rail, and by extension, the rails together. So this is the top of the bolt, and on the other side, we have the lock washer and the bolt itself. But over time, these bolts can often shake loose, or the threads can burn off due to the stress of a train rolling over them for long periods of time. So what our job is, mainly today, while also to spray our track for weeds and other vegetation, is to go along and check as many of these track joints as possible for loose bolts. And if we find any, we're gonna replace them entirely. And I'm sure that we'll find some, because I remember there's at least a few that we've already marked for us to go and do today. So I'll be able to show you guys what it looks like to replace a track bolt. And worst case scenario, a whole rail joint, but we shouldn't have to do that today. And today our ride is simply our CJ Bridges tie inserter hooked to our air compressor cart, which will be our power for our impact gun, which we'll use to remove and reinstall joint bolts, and our flat cart with our North Star herbicide sprayer. And that we're gonna spray our track with here pretty shortly. So we'd start our journey down the track just after 9 a.m., starting just beyond our runaround track. That's where we stopped spraying most recently, and where we'd start spraying this morning. While our track, as you've seen, has since been tamped and regulated, it is very, very hot and humid this Florida summer. So within a month and a half, the weeds are already coming back in full force. After starting the gasoline motor on the herbicide sprayer, we let it run on agitation mode for a few minutes to allow the mixture of water and herbicide to mix inside the tank. You always want to do this for a big tank like this one before spraying any kind of solution, because improper mixture could limit the product's effectiveness when applied. Then when we're ready, we turn off agitation mode and fully open the broadcast valve. That allows the product to fully shoot out the nozzles on the very end of the sprayer, and then we'd start southbound. With product spraying off the rear, we now run at about 1 to 3 miles per hour, allowing for proper saturation of the rock and roadbeds surrounding. And you gotta be fairly careful here. Run too fast and you won't saturate the ground enough to kill anything. Run too slow and you won't use the product as effectively as you could have. And this stuff is fairly expensive, so you want to use it right. Again, we like to stick between 1 and 3 miles per hour, only going slower when the vegetation density is much thicker. But overall, between our varying speeds, a full tank of herbicide got us about 2 miles of track sprayed, only coming to a stop when the broadcast valve ran dry. Alright folks, we've made it to around milepost SW856.6 or 7 about. We're in the swamp and we've just run out of pest or herbicide, so that's our stopping point for spraying. We're gonna have to refill it and start at this point, start spraying again to get the rest of the line sprayed. But everything from Willow to here is now sprayed, so this stuff will probably start to die in the next week or so. It's glyphosate, so it takes about a week to actually kill everything. And I just found that while we're stopped, we're gonna put water in the tie inserter. It's got a little low on water, so we're filling that up. And then we're gonna get going and start checking track bolts and joint bars. Speaking of which, one of those Weber bars just caught my eye. One of those Weber joints, we got one right here. Check that out. So this, like the majority of the rail that is still here, is an original joint bar. It's original to the line, I should say. That right there is the hardened pine wood that holds these bolts in place, because as you can see, there are no lock washers on these bolts. It's simply the bolt and the nuts that are held by that piece of wood. And all these bolts are good. While we're stopping, we're gonna check around on these track bolts. Most of the joint bars we've already checked as we've been progressively going down, replacing our ties. We've checked most of the joints along the way, but we're gonna check what we can when we stop, and we're gonna have to do the ones that we did mark, because we did find some that were bad, so we're gonna do those today. But here's another example of one of those Weber joints, and here's a better example for what I wanna express here, in that these joint bars are special in that they won't receive tie plates, because that long metal plate sheet that's beneath the joint bar is a part of the joint itself. That outer piece of metal on the very end bends and is that plate beneath the joint bar. And so instead of a tie plate, like here at simply a spot in the rail, or a modern joint bar that are simply joint bars and not Webers, these don't need tie plates, because the sheet that's on the underside effectively is the plate that it sits on. And so we simply put spikes in or around it to fasten it to the tie and the rail. We've got more joint bars to check over and plenty of track to cover, so we're gonna get moving here. We didn't find any issues with any bars on the way south towards Dickey Road, and at Dickey Road we'd have to make a quick pit stop because there were about 5 or 6 ties that didn't get spiked throughout our recent maintenance project, and we had to make sure those were spiked down before we did our final pass of regulation later that week. We could have started up the air compressor and used the jackhammer to drive these in, but we decided against it just because there were only a few ties to do. After we ensured that each tie was properly spiked down on each side, we continue south towards our problem joint bars. Alright, we've made it about a quarter mile or so south of the first curve out of Parrish, just south of Dickey Road, and we found our first joint bolt that we're going to have to either tighten up or replace completely. Came across one of the joints that we marked with spray paint, and one of the bolts is loose. I'm not sure if the threads are messed up to the point that we have to replace it entirely, but we'll take a look at it real quick and I'll show you what I'm talking about. And all the bolts are good except for this one on the inside. You can see it's able to move around. There should be no give at all with these track bolts. While I realize it may have been a fairly climactic lead up to this point, this whole process is really very simple. The impact gun runs off compressed air, so you start the air compressor, take the impact gun, and tighten her up. That's just about it. Tighten the nut until it won't move anymore, and as long as nothing breaks, you're good to go. And since this was the only nut and bolt on this joint that had an issue, we're able to move on to another joint entirely now. Alright, just a little further and we've got another one. This one is actually at one of those Weber joints, and you can see it's the original bolt there because there's no lock washer. It's simply the nut, and I don't even have to kick that for you to see how loose it is. So we're gonna correct that, but for the most part the rest of these should be all right. Oh, that one's a little loose too. So actually we got both of these two that are loose, but that one on the end is particularly bad. Now, sometimes on Weber joints on our line, you will see nuts on them that do have lock washers between it and the joint, like these two on the south end. Since these aren't required or original pieces for these specific kinds of joint bars, these lock washers must have been added at some point when the entire bolt was replaced. So it's likely that these two on the end have been replaced at some point. But because the one on the north end of the joint was particularly as loose as it was, we were going to add a lock washer to the bolt before putting the nut back over it and tightening it up. And while the nut came off easily enough, we'd end up adding a lot more to this joint than a lock washer, because this was the time that something would break. Putting the nut back on and trying to tighten it up, and though you can't see it because John's leg is in the way, the entire bolt would snap in half. And with the nut still stuck in the socket on the impact gun, it would pull out half of the bolt with it. Trying to figure out what the problem is, we'd look through the hole that was now open with the missing bolt, and we'd find that the holes between the wood, the joint bar, and the rail were not lined up, and the hole was now too skinny for a new bolt to fit into. And so with that information, it's likely that this hole was already too small for the bolt in question, and so trying to tighten the nut caused the bolt to spin, and the friction ended up breaking the bolt in half. But that raises the question, why is the hole too small to begin with? And while I wasn't able to determine the actual cause for this instance, it's likely that over time, the rail itself had shifted to the south, causing the hole to get tight and the bolt to be stuck inside. This ultimately meant that we would, despite what I said at the beginning of this video, that we would have to entirely replace a whole joint bar. We'd have to remove the Weber joint and replace it with modern style joint bars. The holes on those have much more room for adjustments like the rail has made here. Though we didn't have the right joint bars or the right size socket for the impact gun to make that repair today. So we just marked the area very clearly with spray paint and come back down the following day with the proper equipment to make the swap. That would be incredibly important, because with an issue like this, we could not run our weekend trains over this until the repair was properly made. But for now, we just have to mark it and move on. There were plenty of joint bars to our south with nuts and bolts that needed tightening, and we had to make sure we got as many of those done in the day as we could. And luckily, we wouldn't run into any other issues like that one for the rest of the day. Any other nuts that were loose simply tightened up without a hitch. The following day, we'd all make the trip back down there to fix that joint bar with all of the issues, and while I didn't have my gear with me that day, I did manage to get a picture of the joint bar when we had it fully disassembled and the bare rail exposed. On the left, we have the two leftover elements of the Weber bar that came off the joint, and these two are the new joint bars that would go on with new nuts and bolts to make the proper repair. After I shot that photo, we all got back to work on it, and we had the joint bar fully repaired in another half hour. Alright, so really quickly, I want to give you all a bit of a demonstration on how the locking mechanism has changed between the Weber joints and the modern style joint bars, and what is effectively happening when you add a lock washer or a piece of pine wood to a joint. So here, this is an actual Weber piece. This is that outside piece where all the heads of the nuts are. You'll see a nut on each one here, and the bolts go through each one of these. This will be on the outside of the rail, and this piece will be on the inside. The rail sits right here, and this is the bit of the plate that you see exposed on the inside of the rail. And here is a piece of pine wood that came out of, this is actually the piece of pine wood that came out of that one joint bar that was all messed up that we had to replace entirely. We kept the piece of pine wood, and it'll help because I can show y'all what I'm talking about here. So the piece of wood would effectively go inside the joint right here. These holes would line up, and the rail would sit right about here up on the edge of this. This piece of wood would go inside. And although this is a modern bolt, you kind of get the idea. These would go through like so, and the nut would go on the outside and it would screw on. However, the bolts didn't have these lock washers on them. And what I want to show you about lock washers here is they're essentially a very small spring. You can see how on one side it starts at a lower level and coils up to a higher or lower level depending on which way you go. Point is, the two ends aren't at an even level. The reason for that is when you put this on a bolt like this, because these bolts are for the modern joint bars. So not the Webers, but the modern joint bars that are simply metal bars without the whole curved piece and the plate and all that mess. So you have to imagine here, you have the top of the bolt. The first joint bar is going to be somewhere around here. The rail is going to be in the center. Other joint bar on the outside, and then on the outside of that, you have the lock washer and the nut. And that will screw on, but as you may have been able to see when we were screwing these on with the impact gun, tightening some of these lock washers, when you tighten these down, it compresses what is effectively a spring here and makes the two levels even. The two ends, it makes them level. And effectively what you're doing there is you're compressing a metal spring, and that is putting pressure on this nut, so it's effectively pushing it outwards, putting pressure and as much possible friction against these threads on the bolt, so that keeps the nut from turning. The more friction there is on these threads, the less the nut is going to want to turn, so the more secure the nut is. So that is how lock washers do this. But on the Weber joints, that is what the wood was for. Because, like I said, lock washers weren't invented at the time that these joints were around. So what they did instead was effectively omit the lock washer. This piece is effectively your outside joint bar. Then the piece of wood goes inside that. The rail will be up against the wood, and then you'll have another joint bar on the outside of the rail. And what you do there is you simply stick the bolt through and tighten the nut on the other side. And you tighten that down all the way to the metal plate that is your other side joint bar. And this piece of wood effectively did the same job as the lock washers, because if you recall, these are pine wood. And if you'll also recall from perhaps my previous video where I discussed how we have a lot of original ties on our line, those ties that you may recall have bulged in their centers around the railhead. Those are also made of pine wood. Most railroad ties were made out of pine wood before they switched to oak or whatever wood they use now. But what pine wood does over time, as you can clearly see, is it enlarges, it bulges. So, well, first off, the wood being in here as opposed to another piece of metal or simply a joint bar gives it a bit of a cushion, sort of like this spring-loaded coil does. But also you have to think about, over time, these pieces of wood are gradually going to bulge outwards. So it's going to end up putting pressure on the bolt and the threads of the bolt, pushing the nut outwards. So it still puts pressure on those threads, effectively accomplishing the same thing as the lock washers. And so from 1903 to 2023, this is effectively the evolution of the joint bar. Alright, also while I'm here, I'm going to give you all the little update on the other things going on around the museum, such as in the back shop, on the track, and whatnot else. And because I feel it is my obligation with every one of these videos to give you all an update on the 8330, because so many people are waiting to see it return to the rails. So for that reason, I'll talk about 8330 really quickly, because there really isn't a whole lot to say, and that's because we haven't touched this thing since May. It's been moving around our back shop when we've had to move other things, but apart from that, it's just been kind of sitting here dormant because, we were really kicking into it in May and getting those issues sorted out. We got the batteries, we got some of the electrical issues sorted out, but after all that, we've been sidetracked. Quite literally. We had the track project come up. We spent night after night after day after night on that track, 75 ties a night. Y'all don't understand the extent of what that project was. That was one of the biggest projects that this museum, I think, has ever seen. And we put in well over 2,500 ties across this entire project. And for that reason, we were on a track for effectively 2.5 months. And so we were not in the back shop at all during that time. But yeah, for that reason, we really haven't been doing much with this locomotive, unfortunately. And, perhaps even more unfortunately is that it's October now. And for that reason, we're about to be well into event season in a couple weeks. We have our Pumpkin Patch Express coming up in 2 weeks, and only about a month after that, well, we also have Civil War and World War II in November. But immediately after those two events, we jump right into Christmas, and that is quite literally our $1 million train. And that event is all hands on deck too. So I'm gonna be real with you, we're probably not gonna be laying hands on this thing until probably next year. I mean, event season is no joke. I mean, we are packed in event season, so that's where our money comes from. So that is top priority, because without that, there will be no seeing this again. But with all that prefaced, I will say that in regards to the track, if it didn't go without saying already, that the track is 100% complete. Actually, it's more like 95% complete. We still have some ballast regulation to do. We're waiting on some parts for the ballast regulator to come in. We need some more of those little brushes, and we also need to change out the fuel and the air filters on it before we do any more regulation. But all the ties, like I said, well over 2,500, they are all installed and all the tamping is done. All the tamping from Willow to Parish was completed sometime at the end of August, and just this past week we put in our last 33 ties through the station at Parish. So from the north switch at the north end of the property all the way through the station platform area and through the little curve down to the display train, we put in 33 ties in that section, and now we are totally out. That's something to be proud of, and I certainly am, as well as everybody else who was involved. We are all overjoyed, to be frank with you. So I'm going to roll a few miscellaneous clips for you of some of the track work that was being done throughout August and a little bit of September. But before we get into that, I do want to show you our most recent project over in our event field. The old 567E prime mover that came out of 8330 is now under a pole barn in our event field, and we have got it repainted. I'll show some older clips of it here when we first got it put out in the field, but we've got a pole barn up, we've got lights installed, and we're painting it right now, and we're going to paint it according to this diagram that I'll put on screen here. And that is effectively to show visitors how a diesel prime mover like that one works. So where all the fluids go, certain parts, engine anatomy, simply put. Real quick, heading over to the event field to show you all the new, or the old prime mover from 8330. We'll go ahead and show you. We rehabbed our 4th yard track with new rock, and we also had this tamped by American Track, and we've put a whole bunch of our cars for our Christmas train consist down here, because otherwise these cars would have had to reside in the FP&L spur just past our runaround track. And we've been able to move them in here, which allows for much easier access throughout the year. So if we need to put air conditioning components or fix little issues on them, we don't have to go all the way into FPL to pull them out. They're just simply right down here, along with our other display items. And here is the current condition of 8330's old 645E prime mover. It almost looks like a brand new engine with this new paint. Of course, this isn't complete. We still have to get those dealt with, the exhaust stacks, and obviously the indicators are not on here yet, but this is supposed to be done for our Pumpkin Patch Express event, which is, like I said, in a couple of weeks. So it won't take long to do what we need to do to this, but it already looks fabulous. And the way that we've had this set up is so all of the intake valves and exhaust stacks have been covered, so the elements are not going to affect the insides of this engine. And so if we need parts for other locomotives, we can take from this display and put them in our active locomotives, because this is effectively an EMD 567 prime mover block. And the only difference between the regular EMD 567As, Bs, BCs, and Cs is that 8330's was designated a 645E because its original 567 block got 645 piston liners, which gave it a little extra horsepower. So the actual engine block is of a 567, but the piston liners were from a 645, which was the successor to the 567. And basically all of our EMD locomotives, so 1835, 204, and 8330, they all ran using 567 engine blocks. And so most of the parts on this prime mover are interchangeable between this and any other 567 block that we have. And so although this is a display piece, we can take inner parts off of this if we need to and interchange them with pieces on our active locomotives should we ever have the need to. Taking y'all about a month back here now. I forget exactly what day this was taken on, but this was sometime near the beginning of August. This day, the folks at American Track had just made it across Dickey Road with their tamper and were now tamping the final 2 miles to Parrish. I had just so happened to stumble across them in this position as I had come down to Dickey Road to do my weekly inspection. And so we can once again observe the very articulate process of gripping the rails, lifting them with the jack, and pushing material up underneath the railroad ties. And moving back up to Dickey Road, my inspection here would give us just a little look at what kind of a difference that makes. American Track was only a few hours into their work this day, so the section we're looking at here had been tamped and leveled just a few hours ago. But you can see now just how level and straight the track, which is still 75-pound jointed rail, now is. And yes, it looks level and all, but the difference is especially noticeable when compared with this video that I took at the same location on May 4th of this year. 2 months before American Track arrived on our property, this is what the north side of Dickey Road looked like. And now with the proper tamping and multiple railroad ties replaced in this section, you can see just what a difference it makes to the track structure. And all of that makes for the night and day ride difference that has been noted over our entire track now that all the work has since been completed. Alright, welcome back. Well, quick little update here. It's October 18th and Florida has given us just a little taste of winter. It's 52 degrees this morning. It's been 52 degrees the last couple of mornings, but it's supposed to warm back up today, and we're gonna get back into the 80s, but I think we're at the part of the year we're finally out of the 90s for a while, so at the very least that'll be nice, and we're kind of relying on cold fronts for the rest of the year to stay, you know, cool, but for the most part it feels beautiful outside. But just yesterday we got our Pumpkin Patch Express put together, and as you can see, it's a pretty big train. It takes up our entire yard, and we are quite literally stretched across the north end too. We can't even get over that crossing right there, so we're kind of boxed in on this end. We actually have the train cut on the south end so we can actually get out of here. Guess a lot of people come to these things, so I guess that's why we have all this train to put them on. It's a lot of train. About 1,000 feet, more or less. So Pumpkin Patch is this upcoming weekend as well as the weekend following, so I suppose I kind of am advertising the event through this video in a sense, but I'd like to think that we're pretty short on tickets now, and by the time I get this posted, we'll have probably been through our first weekend, so all that. And then there's also a mini track project that came up for this week, kind of out of nowhere, and I'm not gonna go into that because I'm gonna have a separate video for it, but this is the week where a rail broke, so well, you'll see that video at some point, but I think this one's probably gonna go up first. And might I mention, the train is also positioned where it's going to be spotted when it arrives at the yard, so all the cars are lined up at the proper ramps. So we're going to be blocking that crossing on the north end. And we have the train cut right here so we can, you know, get out. But, you know, when it's put together, you know, we're gonna be very well stretched out over the road here. So we've got the grass getting cut right now, but that field is going up nicely, and Pumpkin Patch comes this weekend and the following weekend. We've also got a new addition to the event field. Nice big old pole barn. This will effectively be a permanent rendition of the big tent that usually goes here for big events like Pumpkin Patch and North Pole. This is usually where people will eat food that they've purchased from the vendors that come out. And this is also where the murder mystery event will be held, and the performances will be held under this as well. This effectively saves us from having to rent the tent that we would otherwise have to put up each year for each one of those events. This gives us a permanent setup to use year-round, and we can also use this for weddings or other events that people can, you know, pay us to have here. Supposedly there actually is a wedding that's being held under this in a few days. I don't know much about it, but I just heard word of mouth that there's going to be a wedding here pretty soon. So a rather interesting addition, but it will both save and make us money, so that's pretty neat. And it's a nice structure too. They did a good job with it, except for all the, you know, dirt they left around the posts, but you know, we can get rid of that. For a bit of context, here's a little sneak peek at our rail replacement that would happen on the 18th of October that would ultimately take us about 5 hours to do. But this is all I'm going to show you for now because, again, I've got a video coming up for it fairly soon. Alrighty folks, back in the yard. Quick update from Thursday, October 19th. This is the old rail that we pulled out of the track, just shy of 30 feet. We can cut the end of that rail and make it so we have this piece to use for something else should we need it. But that's done. The new rail's in. I'll have the video for that ready in a few weeks. And the only real thing to look at now is our Pumpkin Patch Express, which is heading down to Parrish for staging tomorrow. As you may be able to tell, we had a couple last minute changes to the consist blocks, but now our newly restored Seaboard Coastline 1061 is now in the consist, and we also had to pull one of our stainless cars off. And that is why the train is no longer cut on the south end, because we have access over that dirt road crossing on the north end now. Some of you may also notice is that 204 has a little bit of decor this year. Over the course of my years watching trains at this place, it occurred to me that the locomotives never get decorated for this event. So I took it upon myself to add some decor. Some garland, makeshift wreaths. What's not to love? So assuming that I get this video posted anytime during our Pumpkin Patch event before it's over, maybe it's of interest to some of y'all to come out and see our train this year. The locomotives, to my knowledge, have never been decorated before, which is exactly why I wanted to do it. And I think it came out pretty well. I tried something a little different. I may have to recenter that, but the other side looks fine, but this side's a little crooked, it seems. You see what I tried to do there? Put a pumpkin over the IMC leaves. So instead of leaves, we got a little pumpkin in there. How noticeable is it going to be to the average person? I have no idea. Especially because the handrail is kind of in the way, but it's not too bad. And we've got a whole bunch of other people decorating the rest of the train. So I'm doing the locomotives, but there's a few ladies that are getting the train all spiffy for the weekends. And the next big thing, and the final part of this video, is that our new rail has been installed for the weekend. Obviously, because we don't want a rail with a defect such as that going into event season, or any event for that matter. So tomorrow, for when they take this train to Parrish, I'm gonna make my way down there so we can get a look at this whole train rolling over that rail, and that'll kind of serve as my inspection to make sure that the rail stays in place and everything's good, because this will be the first train over the new rail, so to speak. So it's important to make sure that it looks good going over. All right, everybody, welcome back. It's Friday, October 20th, and today's the day they take the Pumpkin Patch Express down to Paris for staging. So we've made our way down the track to the rail we've replaced. We'll take a quick look at it, and this little bit here will be in both videos, my update as well as the dedicated video for the rail. So we'll take a quick look, and we got the train coming south. So this will be our inspection to make sure the rail looks good. This will also be y'all's first look at our Pumpkin Patch Express for 2023. All right, so here's the start of the new rail here. It's interesting, you can see how the new rail is so much less shiny than the old ones, because obviously no trains have run this rail yet. So we've got new nuts and bolts, and actually had to replace a Weber joint on the south end of this rail. So 32 feet of new rail went in here. So new rail up until the next joint here. This was a Weber joint until we got it swapped out with this modern one. And it fits good, looks good. So Pumpkin Patch Express is on the way. So we'll see how it looks going over. Alright, 204 looks good on the roll by on the east side. Everything's rolling good. Rail secure. Y'all have a safe trip. Over.
204 copy. No defects.
Alrighty, well, good deal. Rail held, looks very good. Everything's in the way it should be, and the train rolled over just fine. So they'll be good for Pumpkin Patch, and for the foreseeable future, that new rail will do us well. And as for my video, this concludes that too. So we've got Pumpkin Patch the next 2 weekends. I'll probably have this posted by the time one weekend's by, but for otherwise, happy, perhaps early or belated Halloween, depending on my schedule in this video. But happy Halloween to all of my viewers nonetheless, and I appreciate you watching, and hopefully I'll see y'all again pretty soon from the Florida Railway Museum. But for now, from the Florida Railway Museum at milepost SW, roughly 856.3, I'll see you next time on the Sunshine State Rails.
Out of curve on the bottom, 204. 204 copy, 0, 0. Thank you.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.